Canada charges us 250% for our milk product and other product. Yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
What happens when a superpower pulls out the very first brick from the wall, holding up its own economy, and mistakes the cracking sound for applause? That question became real the moment 5 words were spoken on a global stage. We don't need their lumber. It sounded bold, even triumphant, like the opening move of a grand industrial duel. But hidden beneath that confidence was a pressure point no one expected the country to push, a pressure point that held together the spine of America's construction engine. With that single line, a quiet chain reaction began, one so deep and so structural that by the time Washington realized what had been set in motion, the damage was already climbing toward the tens of billions. At the very heart of the shock lies a cold truth most people never see. Lumber is not a luxury import. It is not a bargaining chip in a negotiation room. It is the unseen foundation under every new home, every school expansion, every office rising from a suburban lot. When the price of that foundation explodes, the cost of an entire nation's dreams explodes with it. That is the twist almost no one saw coming. While the statement sounded like a show of strength, it triggered what economists quietly describe as a self-inflicted trap. A moment where a wall built to defend an economy ends up becoming the very cage that restricts it. Within weeks, the consequences began to spread through the American housing market like shockwaves traveling through steel beams. Builders paused projects, developers shelved blueprints, buyers watched affordability slip out of reach. Every ripple traced back to those same 5 words. And yet here is the part that stings most. The blow did not land on Canada, it landed on the United States itself. The nation that pulled the trigger became the first to feel the recoil. And beneath all the headlines and all the noise sits the quiet, uncomfortable truth this video is about to uncover. The real collapse began inside the walls America built to protect itself. The collapse didn't announce itself with alarms or warnings. It began with a sentence, 5 calm, unshaken words spoken on an international stage, drifting into the microphones as if they were nothing more than political theater. Yet beneath that surface, those words struck the core of a supply chain so essential, so deeply embedded into the American economy, that the audience couldn't possibly know a fracture had just begun. We don't need their lumber. The declaration sounded decisive, sharp, even triumphant. But the moment it echoed across the room, it triggered a silent chain reaction inside the very framework that keeps America building, expanding, and growing. It is easy to mistake confidence for control, easy to believe strength is proven by shutting a door. But sometimes, closing a door seals off the oxygen a system relies on without anyone realizing it. Lumber is one of those invisible sources of oxygen. It's not a luxury import or a bargaining chip to wave during negotiations. It's the skeleton inside every American home and every school renovation. It's the quiet protagonist behind suburban neighborhoods, high-rise expansions, and millions of construction jobs. And when pressure is placed on that skeleton, the entire body begins to feel it long before the public understands what is happening. The shock that followed those 5 words didn't burst forward like an explosion. It spread like a vibration through steel beams, slow, deep, structurally devastating. The market reacted first. Prices climbed, then surged, then broke into a kind of upward sprint that builders could no longer outrun. Suppliers tightened inventories. Developers stared at budgets that no longer made sense. And in the background, the wall of tariffs that was supposed to protect domestic industry began behaving like an airtight chamber, trapping the American construction sector inside with rising costs and diminishing supply. That is the irony. At the center of this story, the wall built to keep trouble out ended up sealing trouble in. Most Americans never realize the United States does not produce enough softwood to build its own homes. It hasn't for decades. The missing volume is enormous. And the one country that reliably filled that void quietly, consistently, dependably was Canada. The relationship wasn't one of rivalry. It was interdependence, 2 economies locked together like gears in the same machine. Canadian lumber flowed in because American demand required it. American growth continued because that flow was steady. Disrupting that link wasn't a strategic move in a geopolitical duel. It was the equivalent of removing a load-bearing beam while assuming the ceiling would somehow hold. And this leads to the core truth, the payoff, that must be revealed immediately. The sentence, "We don't need their lumber," backfired almost instantly, because America did, in fact, need it. Every nail driven into a house frame depended on it. Every project scheduled on a construction calendar relied on it. Every mortgage forecast, real estate market projection, and city expansion plan assumed its price would remain stable. When tariffs pushed that cost upward, the entire housing market absorbed the impact like a shock wave. Home building costs surged by thousands of dollars per unit. Developers froze plans mid-blueprint. Families already struggling with affordability watched prices move even further out of reach. All these outcomes traced back to the moment the supply chain's most dependable link was strained by a barrier it could not bypass. But here is the part that stunned analysts the most. Canada did not collapse under the weight of the tariffs. It adapted. It expanded into new markets. It shifted its industry toward higher-value wood products. It diversified exports beyond the United States for the first time in decades. While American builders were forced to slow down, Canada found a way to accelerate. The intended target remained standing. The nation that built the wall felt the first cracks. This is the paradox at the center of the story. A defensive economic move morphed into a self-inflicted trap. A statement meant to show strength exposed a vulnerable foundation. And what began with 5 words spiraled into a multi-billion-dollar shock, absorbed entirely by the country that spoke them. The question now isn't whether the backfire happened, it's how deeply the damage spread beneath the surface and what it reveals about the hidden architecture of modern economic power. The wall that closed from the inside. The moment Washington moved from words to action, the tone of the entire conflict changed. What began as a bold declaration quickly hardened into policy, and policy hardened into a barrier, a commercial wall rising between two economies that had spent decades building each other. Tariffs were introduced like bricks stacked one after another, forming what officials publicly described as a shield for domestic industry. But shields don't always protect the warrior. Sometimes they block the view of the battlefield. The new lumber duties did not arrive quietly. They moved like steel shutters falling into place. 55% at first, then climbing toward a combined 59.5% as every penalty layer locked in. These numbers weren't just percentages. They were structural pressure points, squeezing a market that ran on precision, balance, and thin supply margins. Yet the most striking detail about this wall is not how tall it was, but how suddenly it appeared. For decades, America's construction engine ran on an unspoken understanding. Canada supplied the wood, and the United States supplied the demand. When Washington tightened the flow, it assumed domestic producers would simply step in and lift the load. But that assumption was built on a mirage. The United States has never had enough softwood capacity to stand alone, not in the 1,990 seconds, not in the 2000s, and certainly not today. The country can produce tremendous volumes of timber, yes, but not the specific kinds used to frame homes and construct the skeletons of buildings. The gap is structural. It is an architectural flaw in the nation's industrial blueprint, and when tariffs forced that flaw into the open, it became impossible to ignore. Inside lumber mills across the Pacific Northwest and the American South, operators watched demand rise faster than their equipment could respond. Even if every mill ran non-stop, even if every tree on available land were marked for harvest, the internal supply would still fall short. Meanwhile, Canadian mills, which had built their operations precisely around this cross-border equilibrium, suddenly faced a wall they could not climb without paying heavily for every board foot. Publicly, the tariffs were framed as a call to revive American industry, to reclaim supply chains, to build with American hands. But an industry cannot be revived by force if the fundamentals are not there. A 450% increase in harvesting on federal land, the level required to replace Canadian imports, was not physically possible under environmental law, nor politically possible under voter scrutiny. What Washington attempted was the economic equivalent of asking a 2-story factory to suddenly produce enough output for a 10-story skyline. It wasn't ambition, it was physics, and physics did not bend. As the wall tightened, another unexpected dynamic emerged. While Canadian lumber struggled to reach the U.S. market under steep penalties, European suppliers began slipping into the gap. What Canada lost, Europe gained. Shipments from Germany, Sweden, and other regions started flowing into ports along the East Coast. These weren't shortcuts or loopholes. They were the natural redirection of global supply lines, searching for open doors when a major one had been slammed shut. The result was an outcome few in Washington had anticipated. The wall that was supposed to keep foreign wood out ended up welcoming new suppliers, and suppliers with longer shipping routes, higher costs, and fewer long-term ties to American builders. And that is the essence of the miscalculation. The wall didn't safeguard American self-sufficiency. It rerouted the flow of commerce, reshaping the map in ways that weakened the very market the tariffs were meant to defend. Builders weren't turning to American forests. They were turning to European sawmills, not out of preference, but out of necessity. Because when a wall closes, a doorway opens somewhere else, and rarely in the direction its architects intended. What makes this chapter of the story so striking is that the tariffs did not strike a rival. They struck a dependency. They struck the invisible foundation supporting millions of American construction jobs and billions of dollars in housing activity. The United States wasn't launching an offensive in a global economic duel. It was tightening a belt around its own midsection, assuming it could breathe through the pressure. And the most revealing detail of all is that the damage didn't appear instantly. It crept in like rising water behind a sealed door. Lumber prices climbed. Supply thinned. Builders hesitated. And before the nation realized what was happening, the wall meant to protect the economy had become a cage, one that closed from the inside, not the outside. The day the skeleton of the housing market began to tremble. The first places to feel the impact were not the halls of Washington or the boardrooms of multinational companies. The tremors surfaced in places much quieter: construction sites at dawn, lumber yards before opening hours, contractor offices where cost sheets are studied like delicate medical charts. It was here, in the daily rituals of an industry that keeps the country expanding, that the true consequences of the tariff wall began to spread like cracks inside a foundation. Lumber is the skeleton of American construction. It is the unseen latticework beneath drywall, the ribs inside every suburban home, the spine that supports entire neighborhoods. When the cost of that skeleton is jolted upward, the shock travels all the way through the body, from the contractor reading the new price per board foot, to the developer calculating whether a project still survives, to the family signing a mortgage on a home that suddenly cost far more than it did 3 months earlier. That is how the tariff wall transformed from a policy into a pressure wave, rippling through an industry that could not outrun it. Within months of the tariff hike, the numbers stopped being fluctuations and became patterns. A quiet consensus formed among builders. Something fundamental had broken. The price of lumber climbed sharply, then climbed again, then refused to come down. In a sector where even a 1% change in material costs can destabilize entire projects, the increases were staggering. Homes that had been budgeted in January were no longer viable by March. Construction firms that had operated on tight margins suddenly found themselves underwater. Bids were withdrawn, contracts renegotiated, timelines stretched into the unknown. Behind every stalled project was a human story. Families who had saved for years watched their dream homes delayed indefinitely. Developers holding blueprints for new communities began whispering about cancellations. Cities counting on new housing to meet rising populations saw their projections collapse. And the hardest truth threaded through all of these events: the rising costs were not caused by scarcity in nature. They were caused by scarcity, engineered by policy. When the wall of tariffs sealed off access to the most stable supply of lumber the United States had, the entire market inhaled sharply and kept gasping. Economists later described this moment with an eerie metaphor: the hidden tax. It wasn't written in legislation or announced in speeches. It emerged in silence, embedded in every board foot of lumber that crossed the border under new penalties. That hidden tax eventually translated into an average of more than $10,000 added to the cost of a single-family home. And that was just the beginning. When analysts at housing institutions ran the numbers across the entire national shortage, millions of homes needed but unbuilt, the added cost ballooned into the tens of billions. Yet the most startling effect wasn't just the price increase, it was the slowdown. Construction, a sector that powers nearly 6% of the American economy, began to freeze. Developers postponed breaking ground, contractors slashed lumber orders in hopes that prices would reverse. But the reversal never came. The market was trapped between an urgent need for housing and a supply chain suffocated by rising costs. Every delay widened what economists called the affordability canyon, a gap between what homes cost to build and what Americans could afford to pay. And within that canyon, another force gathered: hesitation. large-scale builders, usually the engines of new housing construction, grew cautious. Investors, uncertain how long the volatility would last, slowed funding. Even local governments, expecting growth from new housing developments, found themselves recalculating revenue and infrastructure plans. The ripple had become a wave. For many, the shocking realization came too late. The housing crisis wasn't just about price. It was about velocity, the rate at which new homes could be produced. Once that velocity slowed, the market lost one of its most critical pressure valves. Demand kept growing. Supply stood still. And the tariffs acted like a tightening band, squeezing the entire system until the nation felt the pressure in the most personal of ways. Rising rents, shrinking availability, and neighborhoods where developments halted mid-construction. This chapter of the story is not about international conflict. It is about an economy quietly suffocating under its own protective armor. The wall built to strengthen domestic industry ended up pushing the housing market toward its breaking point. And the skeleton that holds up the American dream, a home, a roof, a foundation, began to tremble under the weight of a decision no one thought would echo so far downstream. The paradox inside the fortress. Long before tariffs hardened into walls, the United States had lived with a truth that rarely reached public debates or campaign stages. The country simply did not have enough softwood lumber to sustain itself. The gap wasn't a small crack. It was a canyon, a structural shortage embedded into the nation's construction DNA. And when Washington attempted to build a fortress of economic protection, the walls only exposed that shortage more dramatically than ever before. This paradox is the heart of the story. A country tried to defend an industry it didn't fully possess, using tools that assumed self-sufficiency where there was none. The result was not a strengthened domestic sector, but a spotlight shining directly onto its vulnerabilities. For decades, American consumption of softwood lumber has outpaced domestic production. The forests are vast, yes, but the type of lumber needed for framing homes, the core of residential construction, has never been produced in sufficient quantities. Even if the country stopped all exports overnight, even if every mill ran at maximum speed, even if every available acre of harvestable land were pushed to its limit, the United States would still end up short. The numbers are irrefutable. The country would still face a supply gap of around 7% in the best-case scenario. And in an industry built on thin margins and tight timelines, 7% is not a gap, it is an abyss. Layer on top of that the environmental and political realities. Increasing harvesting on federal land by 450%, the level required to replace Canadian imports, wasn't just unrealistic, it was impossible. Conservation laws, ecological protections, and decades of public pressure meant that any attempt to expand logging would be met with fierce resistance. Lumber, unlike other commodities, is tied to ecosystems as much as it is tied to markets. For every additional acre harvested, there is a community, a watershed, or a species that stands in the path of approval. The United States couldn't simply grow its way out of this shortage. This is where the fortress metaphor gains its weight. The tariffs were intended to strengthen the economy by closing off external pressures, but a fortress can only function if the supplies stored inside are enough to feed the army. When the tariffs rose like steel gates, they didn't secure the supply line, they blocked it. And inside that sealed chamber, the construction industry found itself facing a hunger it could not satisfy. The irony deepened further. As Canadian lumber became more expensive due to tariff penalties, the U.S. market instinctively searched for alternatives. But alternatives were limited. American mills couldn't produce enough. Shipping from Europe was slower and more expensive. And other global suppliers lacked the scale or reliability that the North American market required. The result was a strange, almost cinematic twist. The very wall designed to keep foreign wood out ended up forcing the country to import even more foreign wood, just not from the neighbor it had relied on for decades. Cargo ships from Europe began appearing at American ports like unexpected guests, filling a void that should never have existed. It was the economic equivalent of closing the main exit during an emergency and watching the crowd rush toward narrower, more dangerous pathways. The system didn't collapse, but it strained. Costs rose. Logistics faltered. Timelines stretched. And across the country, the housing market felt the tension as if someone had pulled the slack out of a tightly wound cable. Economists began referring to this phenomenon as the closed-loop effect. It describes what happens when a country builds a wall around itself, believing the wall will offer protection, only to discover that the protection becomes confinement. Demand bounces inside the enclosure with no safe outlet. Supply shrinks, costs rise, and the pressure builds until something cracks. In this case, the crack appeared not in the fortress walls but in the blueprint of the economy itself. The assumption underpinning the tariffs that domestic producers would surge forward to fill the gap proved to be a myth. The American lumber sector could not expand fast enough, could not harvest freely enough, could not compete with the scale or efficiency of Canada's highly integrated forestry system. The tariffs did not trigger a renaissance, they triggered a reckoning. Behind closed doors, industry analysts used an even sharper metaphor. They said the U.S. had walked into a circular hallway, a place where every door led back to the same point: insufficient supply. The harder the system pushed, the more evident the shortage became. And with each loop around that hallway, the costs spiraled higher and the timeline stretched further. This chapter of the story reveals a truth many prefer not to say aloud. Protectionism only works when there is something substantial to protect. In this case, the protection highlighted the absence. The fortress was built, yes, but the fortress was empty, and the industry trapped inside it was forced to confront a reality it could no longer outrun. The silent countermove. How Canada turned a wall into a doorway. While the United States struggled within the sealed chamber of its own making, another transformation was unfolding just beyond the border. Quiet, deliberate, almost surgical in its precision. Canada, the supposed target of the tariff wall, did not collapse under the weight of rising duties. Instead, it began to move with the calm, calculated rhythm of a player who had studied the board long before the game began. At first, Canadian lumber producers felt the shock like anyone would. Order volumes dipped, trade flows tightened. Mills that had spent decades synchronizing their operations to American demand suddenly found themselves staring at a barrier reinforced with steel percentages and political certainty. But, where many expected panic, something very different emerged. The industry didn't retreat, it adapted. Canadian lumber companies shifted their gaze away from the wall and toward the horizon. If the U.S. market had closed its main gateway, the global market still had dozens more. Europe, Japan, South Korea, the Middle East, Northern Africa, all regions with growing demand for high-quality wood products became new destinations. What had once been a Canada to America conveyor belt evolved into a branching network stretching across oceans and continents. And as global lumber prices continued climbing due to U.S. tariff pressure, Canadian exporters found that markets abroad were willing to pay premium rates. This was the first quiet countermove, transformation through diversification. But the more strategic countermove happened inside Canada's own borders. For decades, Canada had been known primarily as a supplier of raw lumber long boards, dimensional timber, the building blocks of construction. Now, under pressure, the industry shifted upward along the value chain. Rather than exporting simple lumber, companies began reinvesting profits into manufacturing advanced engineered products: cross-laminated timber panels, glulam beams, hardwood composites, fiber-based materials, and emerging bioproducts used in packaging, construction, and renewable fuel. These weren't side ventures. They were deliberate steps toward becoming something the United States could not easily replace: a global leader in sustainable engineered wood. The irony is unmistakable. While the U.S. sought to protect its domestic industry by raising walls, Canada used the impact of those walls to modernize, innovate, and ascend. The industry became leaner, more advanced, and more competitive in markets that would shape the next decade of global construction. Japan's demand for fire-resistant engineered wood soared. Northern Europe, driven by carbon reduction mandates, turned increasingly toward sustainable forest products for infrastructure. Even African markets, long underserved, began expanding their imports as urban populations grew. Canada stepped into each of these openings with confidence. By mid-2025, exports to non-U.S. markets were rising at a pace not seen in decades. For the first time in modern history, the share of Canadian lumber flowing into the United States dropped below 70%. The dependency that had once defined the relationship cracked, but not in the direction Washington expected. Then came the third countermove: political leverage disguised as patience. The World Trade Organization's 2020 ruling declaring the U.S. duties inconsistent with global trade rules sat quietly in Canada's pocket like an unopened letter. There was no need to brandish it, no need to escalate. Ottawa understood the longevity of the game. Time would wear down the American housing market faster than any diplomatic argument. And while the U.S. struggled internally, Canada focused on strengthening its global credibility. Forestry sustainability standards were audited, refined, and promoted, with the precision of a national rebranding effort. Made in Canada wood emerged not as a slogan but as a certification of stability, something the world increasingly valued amid supply chain volatility. Investors took note. Partnerships grew. European builders signed long-term contracts. Japanese firms placed orders for engineered panels years in advance. Meanwhile, American builders trapped within the closed loop created by tariffs watched from a distance as the supplier they once depended on became too globally integrated to rely exclusively on them ever again. This is the twist that rewrites the entire softwood lumber saga. The tariffs meant to pressure Canada ended up liberating it. The duties that were supposed to force negotiation instead pushed Canadian producers to look beyond the United States altogether. The wall designed to keep Canada out of the American market became the force that launched Canada into the world. And in this silent countermove lies a broader lesson about modern economic battles. Power is not held by those who build the tallest walls, but by those who learn how to move when the terrain shifts. Canada didn't need to retaliate. It didn't need to announce a counterstrike. All it had to do was evolve faster than the pressure being applied. By the time the U.S. realized what had happened, the board had changed. The player it thought was cornered had quietly stepped into open space, leaving the walls and the crisis to echo on the other side. The price of a wall and the power of a door. In the end, when all the numbers are tallied, when the freight logs are analyzed and the stalled housing developments are mapped like scars across the country, the story returns to a single truth. The shockwave that reshaped the North American construction landscape did not come from a rival, a competitor, or an unexpected global crisis. It came from a decision made in confidence, a belief that protection could be built through walls rather than through balance. The tariffs were erected to shield an industry, but they revealed that the shield itself was hollow. The United States attempted to stand independently on ground that had never been self-sustaining, and the moment the connection with Canada strained, the pressure cracked inward instead of outward. Material costs surged. Housing affordability collapsed further. Projects froze in place, not because the demand disappeared, but because the supply chain had been tightened to the point of suffocation. Canada, on the other hand, did not rise in defiance or aggression. It rose in adaptation. As the United States turned inward, Canada turned outward. What was meant to be a blow became an opening, a chance to evolve into something larger, more advanced, and more globally connected. While the American market wrestled with scarcity inside a closed loop, Canada walked through the gap and expanded into new continents, new contracts, and new forms of innovation. This is the profound paradox at the heart of modern economic strategy. Strength does not come from isolation. It comes from knowing which partnerships hold up your foundation and which battles are worth fighting. Protecting an industry requires understanding its limits, its dependencies, and the architecture beneath it. A wall built without that understanding doesn't protect, it traps. The softwood lumber saga is more than a trade dispute. It is a case study in how 21st century economies behave under pressure. Supply chains are not lines on a map. They're ecosystems. Break one part, and the entire system shifts. Try to seal off a single artery, and the organism must find a new way to circulate or suffer the consequences. And so the question left standing is not about lumber at all. It's about the future of global strategy itself. In an era of deep interdependence, can any nation truly protect itself by taxing the ground it stands on? Can any wall be tall enough to keep out the costs that rise from within? If this breakdown of the hidden mechanics behind the softwood lumber shockwave helped you see the bigger picture, the strategy, the unintended consequences, the silent countermoves, consider staying with us for the next deep dive. There are more economic battles unfolding behind headlines every day, and each one reshapes the world far more quietly and far more dramatically than most people ever notice. Your support helps bring those stories into the light. If you'd like to see more investigations like this, feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and tell us what part of this Van Co surprised you most.